Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Asia Network for Free Elections and the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar, a very warm welcome to all of you joining us live today. Thank you for being with us for the paper launch titled Old Generals, New Clothes, the Myanmar Junta's Illegitimate 2025-26 Elections and then the Way Forward. Over the past year, both ANFREL and SAC-M have been closely following the developments related to the junta plans elections. In September, ANFREL issued a report, and also in December, SAC-M also shared the initial analysis highlighting concerns around the credibility of these particular elections, particularly in relation to the pre-election environment and the situation in the country since the 2021 military coup. Today's report, the paper built on the work that we did in the past, bringing together evidence-based finding across different phases of the junta stage electoral process, along with the reflections on way forward. So you will hear from the more reflections on the way forward from our speakers very shortly. And also, I would like to share that the report is now available via online in our ANFREL and SAC-M websites. For those who are joining in Zoom shortly, we will also share the link that so you can have the access to our full report. You will also hear from our speakers the most of the things that we have mentioned in our paper as well. So this discussion also being live streams via ANFREL and SAC-M social media platforms. At the end of the discussion, we will also open the floor for your question and that our speakers will provide their answers. And if you are joining via a Zoom platform, so please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section or the chat box. For those who are watching live in social media, you can share your questions in chat box in comment section that later we will share with our speakers for their answers. Additionally, in Burmese interpretation also available today. So if you are more comfortable with Burmese translation and interpretation, please feel free to switch on the interpretation section so you can follow the discussion in Burmese language. So without taking much time, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have three panelists joining with us for the discussion that you will also get to ask questions later at the end of the discussion. First, we have Ms. Brizza Rosales. She is the Executive Director of ANFREL. Welcome, Brizza.
Take it, Arindu.
And we also have Mr. Amaël Vier. He is the one who put a lot of effort behind the paper, our election analyst. Welcome, Amaël.
Thank you. Good morning.
We also have Mr. Ben Lee. He is the Executive Director of SAC-M, Special Advisory Council for Myanmar. Good morning, Ben. Hi. All right. So then without taking a lot of time, so I would like to warmly invite Ms. Brizza Rosales to take the floor. She will more dive into why this paper, why we are releasing this paper and what is the importance, and also provide more background on what we as ANFREL and also SAC-M did in the past when it comes to the junta stage elections. Floor is yours, Brizza.
Thank you again, Tarindu, and good morning again, everyone, especially to those our participants in the Zoom and to those watching us live in different social media pages. Thank you for joining us today. So just like what Tarindu mentioned, we are here to launch the paper, the joint assessment of the Asian Network for Free Elections, ANFREL, and the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar, we call them SAC-M, on the recent elections in Myanmar. So, of course, this partnership has been very vital because it allowed us to bridge ANFREL's regional expertise in election observation and with SAC-M's legal expertise. and investment and deep regional contextual and analytical understanding of Myanmar. So this assessment is not only grounded in evidence, but also reflective of the lived realities on the ground. And at the same time, this report also builds on our earlier work because last year in September, ANFREL released an initial assessment examining the pre-election environment and raising serious concerns about whether the conditions necessary for a credible electoral process were present. So at that time, we were already seeing warning signs, restrictions on political participation. We have also highlighted the shrinking civic spaces and institutional arrangements that raised fundamental questions about independence and integrity. So today's report takes that analysis further because it reflects on what has actually happened, and what has happened confirms those earlier concerns. So now let me begin with a question that may already be on your mind. Why are we publishing this report given that ANFREL and SAC-M did not deploy an actual election observation mission? Because this is an important question. Because election observation is not simply about being present. It is not about showing up for the sake of it. Because observation is meaningful, of course, only when there is a genuine electoral process to observe, one that meets the minimum democratic conditions, including competition, inclusiveness, transparency, and respect for fundamental freedoms as articulated in the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation. So in Myanmar, just like what we have highlighted last year, these conditions were not present. And deploying observers in such a context risk doing more harm than good. So it risks normalizing a process that lacks credibility and inadvertently reinforcing a narrative of legitimacy. So rather than observing, of course, we made a deliberate and principled decision. We chose to assess. A continuous assessment since last year until the phases of the election. So this assessment is grounded in the long-term engagement in Myanmar, at least for ANFREL, because we did the election observation mission in 2015, 17, 18, and 2020. And then it is also informed by a lot of extensive desk review and consultations with civil society, pro-democracy stakeholders, and political actors, many of whom continue to operate under extremely difficult conditions. So the elections organized by the Myanmar Junta cannot be considered legitimate. And just like what we highlighted during our September assessment, so this is not a political position, of course. It is an evidence-based conclusion. And now that the elections have taken place, the evidence is even clearer. Because if we take a look again at the rules of the game, these elections were conducted under the 2008 Constitution, a framework designed by the military itself. So these constitutions guaranteed the 25% of the parliamentary seats to the armed forces, and it gives them the veto power over constitutional change. So even under normal circumstances, this already limits the genuine democratic participation or competition. But even this framework was undermined because following the 2021 coup, the junta extended emergency rule for far beyond what the Constitution allows. So in doing so, they violated the very legal basis they now use to justify these elections. And at the same time, the elections were framed as a response to alleged fraud in the 2020 polls, but yet these claims remain unproven and widely discredited. So independent observers like us in ANFREL, we found no evidence of this systemic fraud that would alter the outcome. So the results reflected the will of the electorate. So what we are seeing is not, of course, a correction of the democratic process, but an attempt to replace it with a controlled outcome. Second, of course, this will be highlighted by Amaël further. So we have also considered the election commission because after the coup, the legitimate Union Election Commission was dissolved and they were replaced a body appointed by the junta. So for us, when we did the assessment in September, this commission is not independent, they are not impartial, and its role is not to protect the vote, but also, of course, to control it. So going through the standards, an election administered under such conditions cannot produce credible results. And thirdly, we have also highlighted this before because we must look at the environment in which these elections were conducted. So elections cannot be, of course, separated from rights and freedoms. And in Myanmar today, those freedoms are systematically denied. So since the coup, thousands have been arrested for expressing their views, journalists have been jailed, media outlets have been shut down, and then internet access has been heavily restricted. And we have seen with a lot of news that we have read, protest is criminalized. And laws such as, of course, the election protection law have been used to silence criticism of the electoral process itself. And individuals have faced decades-long prison sentences simply for opposing the elections. So, of course, we have considered that because taking into consideration that when you express dissent, it can lead to imprisonment. And when information is controlled, and when participation carries real risk, then participation, of course, is no longer free because it is shaped by fear. So under those such conditions, the idea of a free and fair election becomes meaningless. So lastly, fourth point from my end is with regard to the issue of credibility and oversight. We have highlighted here, we have highlighted this issue also with the different advocacy points that we have discussed. That, of course, the junta claimed openness by inviting different observers. But of course, we see this, that in reality, this was just largely symbolic because credible, independent observation missions did not deploy. So of course, ANFREL also made the principal decision not to participate. So the EU has also declined. ASEAN itself did not send a unified observation mission. So instead, the participation came primarily from states aligned with the junta and raising concerns about its independence. So what does this mean? Because it means there was no independent verification, no meaningful transparency, and then at the same time, no credible oversight. So where does this leave us, especially that we did this report, and why this report matters, especially now after the elections? Because we recognize that civil society actors in Myanmar have long been documenting these realities and often at great personal risk, and they are not behind. In many ways, of course, they are ahead. So our role, ANFREL, together with SAC-M, of course, it is not for us to duplicate, but our role is to amplify. And we are bringing these findings to a wider regional international audience because we want to ensure what has happened will not be normalized, will not be ignored, and will not be misrepresented. So of course, from ANFREL, elections cannot be reduced into a mere procedural exercise because for an electoral process to be considered genuine, of course, it must be according to different standards, at least to the DOP standards, and it must be competitive, inclusive, and at the same time conducted in an environment where fundamental freedoms are respected. So based on the evidence assessed in this report, these conditions were not present in Myanmar, and what we have seen is not an election that reflects the will of the people, but a process that fails short of international standard and therefore lacks democratic legitimacy. So for us in ANFREL, again, as an organization committed to electoral integrity across Asia, ANFREL believes that it is our responsibility to speak clearly, grounded in evidence and principle. Hence, the report together with SAC-M, and this is part of our commitment. So right now, back to you, Tharindo, for the other speakers to share their insights as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Brizza, for your initial insights on why this election is illegitimate, and then what conditions that made it, explaining about that as well. I think now it's time to more deeper dive into what happened during these three phases of the elections. Amael, it's the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tarindu. You should see my presentation on your screen now. Let me know if everything's okay. Um, can you just confirm that you see the contents? Okay.
Yeah.
Wait. I think I got kicked out. Tarindu, could you see my... Okay, could you see the screen sharing on my side?
Not anymore.
Okay. Is it up now? Okay, so I will be discussing some of the details that we have observed indirectly. We were not in the country, but we relied a lot on reports from inside the country. So we're especially thankful to independent media, civil society organizations, and CSOs that reported from within Myanmar. We also have supplemented those findings with our own interviews with stakeholders and with our own analysis. So this is a compilation of what we were able to find out on the elections. And to be honest, I think very few of what I'm going to present is going to be a surprise to people who have been paying attention. The people of Myanmar fundamentally understood that these elections could not be democratic. ANFREL and SAC-M and other international organizations ahead of the elections pointed out the deep flaws in this electoral process, so-called electoral process. So in a lot of ways, this was very predictable. And what happened was exactly what we were expecting. Still, there are some details that I think are important to pay attention to, because they highlight really how the junta manipulated everything in its power to put up this facade of democracy and to pursue self-legitimation. The staged elections failed to meet international standards on numerous counts. This included the fact that the junta's elections only were held in a minority of the country, despite the claims of the junta. They were held under a very restrictive legal framework that stifled criticism, and there was no genuine political competition either. There were widespread and credible reports of voters being intimidated to the polls. The junta, as mentioned by Brizza earlier, installed its own election commission, as well as designed an electoral system that was very favorable to the military-aligned USDP party. There were also indications of fraudulent use of advanced votes to favor the USDP, something that is an old playbook of the military junta in Myanmar. Overall, every aspect of those junta-staged elections was engineered to ensure a predetermined outcome. And at the end, I will show a little bit of what this outcome is. So starting with the territorial coverage, you may have seen maps such as this one. This is the coverage of the elections per township. So this is what junta media has been claiming. There were elections in so many places in Myanmar, but what this doesn't take into account is that there were widespread election cancellations, including within the townships where elections were called. So the truth is that in a lot of those townships in blue that did have elections to some degree, a lot of them actually, most of them only had partial elections. So only about 40% of all the country's townships had elections held in full. This is according to DVB data, Democratic Voice of Burma, so thank you for them. And then you had a lot of townships that either had elections in part of the township or elections in really just a few urban areas, and everything else outside the city center, people were not able to vote because of conflict or because simply the junta was logistically incapable to organize those elections because it did not control the area or because it was conducted military operations instead of elections. These really went hand in hand in many places. And then you had 67 townships that had no elections whatsoever. So when you actually update the map that you have on the left to reflect those cancellations, there's a lot more red. This is when you break down by village or village tract or ward. Again, credit to, okay, my PowerPoint got kicked out, it looks like. We'll try again. There we go. So credit again to DVB for making this map. You can see that a lot of the country did not have elections in any aspect. I will also point out that all of the infographics that you are seeing are all in the report. So I'm just trying to show you visualizations of the data so that it's a little bit more interactive. I don't think there's a need for us to share the PowerPoints because that's all from the report. So you'll get better quality images straight from the SAC-M or ANFREL website. I would highly encourage for more detailed analysis to go directly to the paper launch, because this is what we're doing today. And according to DVB's best assessment of the territory, only 42% of Myanmar actually had elections held. 58% were non-polling areas. I do have to mention here that this is a high-level estimate, not necessarily an exact measurement. This is simply due to the nature of mapping tools at the local level. Moving on, so we already saw most of the territory was not included, but most of the people also were not included. 13.14 million people, according to the junta, cast ballots out of the 24 million eligible voters. This is very low, first because in 2020, 27.5 million people were able to vote. So there were more people voting in 2020 than even registered voters in the junta's elections. And then the voter turnout was quite low. This is the official voter turnout, by the way, which stands at 54%, which perhaps it's not a coincidence that it sits just above the 50% symbolic threshold. Myanmar's election laws does not require a minimum voter turnout. But of course, politically, we know that Min Aung Hlaing for years has been touting an over 50% participation rate. So we don't have evidence that these are doctored figures, but we have suspicions that it might not be a coincidence. That's as far as we can go at this time. Also, something very important, this 50% voter turnout claim does not align with observations on the ground made by independent media or CSOs. A lot of polling stations were seen to be empty throughout election day, and there were widespread reports across the country of voters being intimidated so that they went to vote at gunpoint or under pressure from junta administrators. Some of these examples of intimidation included people being pressured with threats ranging from denial of travel documents or guest registration privileges to their businesses being forced to close, or even the children of family members being drafted into the military. So a lot of people really expressed the fact that they did not vote because they wanted to, they voted because they had to. And it was really more self-preservation than anything else that a lot of people went to the polls. Regardless of the junta's claims regarding turnout, very few people actually were looking forward to those elections. You had people who were pretty much expected to vote. That included civil servants, members of the military, their family members. Those, because the junta exerts a lot of control over them, were pretty much, their hands were tied and they had to take part in the farce that these elections were. I also want to mention that especially vulnerable groups of people, including internally displaced people, migrant workers, and students, were targeted and often pressured into advance voting. They were threatened with food rations or aid being suspended if they didn't. So a lot of people really voted under pressure. I also want to mention briefly that there was no genuine political competition. This is something that we've highlighted for years. Basically, the junta's political parties registration law enacted in 2023 deregistered over 40 parties immediately. And then you had parties that wanted to compete that were rejected or that were dissolved shortly before the elections. The parties that were unregistered in 2025 represented over 70% of the votes in 2020 and over 90% of the seats in 2020. So you may have had technically 57 parties running in the junta's elections, with only 6 national parties and 51 state original. But the truth is those parties were co-opted by the junta. They were often aligned with junta or militia proxies. And you can see this in a lot of ways. One example here is you can see the leaders of the USDP and the Myanmar Farmers Development Party standing next to each other, very friendly. And these are 2 of the 6 nationwide parties. So as much as you would expect political parties to compete normally in elections, here there were really more friendly relations. And a lot of those parties were there simply to build up numbers and to put up this pretense that there was multi-party democracy when there was not democracy at all, of course, but also the multi-party component was mostly a sham. The electoral system, I will discuss briefly. This might be a bit complicated. Again, I highly recommend that you refer to the report for comprehensive assessment. What's important, the UEC was installed by the junta, and the legitimate UEC was targeted on the day of the coup, with members being arrested and eventually charged for failing to conduct their duty according to the junta. That is not an independent or impartial election management body, so that's been very clear. The electoral system was introduced only in July 2025. So Min Aung Hlaing has promised for years to include proportional representation as part of the electoral system. In the end, it was only 50% proportional representation for the upper house, so Amyota Luto, as well as state and region bodies. So those 2 had 50% proportional representation and 50% first past the post that was historically used, whereas the lower house, Pitu Luto, remained 100% first past the post. What's important here is that the devil is really in the details, and this proportional representation was very little proportional in nature, because you had gerrymandering, you had election cancellations, and features of the party system that made it impossible for parties to compete in more than 1 state or region for most of them. So in the end, the proportional representation was really designed to A, entrench the domination of the USDP, and B, introduce token representation for smaller parties in the new so-called parliament. Something we highlighted in September and something I will demonstrate very much occurred in the end. Very quickly again, 50% of first past the post favors large parties, especially the USDP. Voters were not able to directly vote for proportional representation. That's something that's been very confusing for everybody looking at this closely. You only could vote for first past the post. And then in applicable areas, those votes were converted to allocate seats under PR. So there was this weird double system where you needed a party to be present in the first place. Most likely that was the USDP. They were the only party present all over the country. And then those votes collected would then count towards proportional representation. It was not about intent of the voter, clearly. And then the constituencies, the electoral districts for proportional representation were inconsistently drawn. Some states had 3, some states had 1. There is no logic or reason to this division. And the goal for that is to make it less proportional, because when you have smaller districts, again, this benefits larger parties. And a second benefit of those divisions is that the junta was able to claim a more extensive coverage of their elections. Because if you cancel elections in most of the states, with PR, you can hold it in very small areas and you can claim the entire state had elections. I will demonstrate that right now because I think a visual guide really will tell you more. This is in Rakhine State, which was one of the most extreme examples due to conflicts. We also included Chin State as an example in the report, but truly, this happened at the macro level all over the country. So this is just a demonstration. You could see that for Pitu Luto, you had elections only at the township level, and only 3 out of 17 townships in Rakhine were able to hold elections in some areas. But then when you look at Amyota Luto, because the districts are bigger, immediately you have 50% of the constituencies for first past the post that were able to hold elections, so already a much greater percentage. Northern Rakhine especially, since you only had Sitwe, in blue in the north, and that was only urban areas of Sittwe. But then that got converted into a bigger area for first past the post, and then for proportional representation, the entire state was technically able to vote, or at least all of the representatives under the electoral system were elected, even though a very, very small part of the state was able to vote. So this is how the junta is able to claim extensive coverage, when really it's not at all in practice the experience of people. So Sittwe, a few thousand people in Sittwe decided for all of Northern Rakhine, is basically what I'm trying to say. And this is something we've seen again and again. Very intentional. This was purely an exercise by the junta to create a parliament regardless of the will of the people. I will quickly mention advance voting. Advance voting historically has been used by the military to, in the past, to stuff ballot boxes. In this case, not exactly that, but we can see that the USDP has really gotten a huge advantage from advance votes, mostly from members of the military and civil servants. Anybody who registered in advance, the USDP got 15% at least of their votes nationwide from advance votes, while other parties on average got only about 4%. So these advance votes were stacked towards the USDP. There are some constituencies where USDP won only because of the advance votes. In phase one, there was 13 constituencies alone. There were also highly dubious circumstances for advance votes. Sometimes they would show up very late at night on election day. Other times they would show up without the paperwork, without supporting documentation. Even the parties that were co-opted by the junta that took part in the election, even they complained that advance votes were not transparent, or there was no scrutiny. So these were, again, parties aligned with the junta that push out the same narrative, and they were unhappy about how that was managed. So that should really tell you these advance votes were a way to manipulate results as much as possible. Something very telling as well, a single township reported 862 advance votes from overseas, which is a huge number considering that according to the UEC, fewer than 6,000 overseas Myanmar citizens registered to vote in the elections. So it's not even 6,000 ballots, 6,000 registrations. And then out of this, a single township in the country has nearly 1,000. This simply does not add up. And these inconsistencies are all over the place. So advance voting is highly suspicious, to say the least. Historically, that was the rigged procedural point. And again, that has proven to be true. 77% of advance votes in phase one went to the USDP. Again, these are examples. There's a lot more in the paper itself about how those votes were used. And what you need to know also, in 10 Pituloto townships, a majority of USDP votes came from advance voting. These were usually townships in active conflict areas. So the higher percentage of military troops, the higher percentage of advance votes for the USDP. So there are trends that you could highlight, really. Moving on to the election protection law, any kind of criticism or call for boycotts of the election was severely suppressed by the junta. Over 350 confirmed individuals have been charged and or arrested, 84 arrested, 269 charged, including some very long prison sentences. There are some youth that have been convicted to over 40 years of hard labor for posting stickers against the election. So this was absolutely not a freedom of speech environment, as one could expect. Very briefly on the international observers mentioned by Brizza as well. These were completely unprofessional and not independent. You can see a picture here. There's a voter in the middle, and all of the observers are looking over his shoulder. This is not what election observation should ever look like. These are people who do not have a principled methodology. They were invited by the UEC. Their trips were paid for by the UEC. And as Brizza said, they were either friendly state actors or friendly private actors whose only purpose was really to rubber stamp the junta's elections. And then the outcome, of course. With all of those caveats, we expected the USDP to win. And I'm really putting quotation marks on winning, because these were not fair elections by any measure. But the USDP, in fact, did win according to the UEC, and over 80% of seats in the national parliament, of elected seats, went to the USDP. So there's a lot of green on the map, and there's a lot of green in parliament, with the darker green being the military appointees. And you can see only a few seats really went to other parties. This is P2 Luto, so this is the most majoritarian system, but heavy domination of the USDP. There's no contest in this new parliament. Same thing at the Amyota Luto level. Again, a lot of green. You can get a better look at the maps in the paper again, but what's especially interesting on the map on the right for proportional representation is that in every single district, the USDP either came first or came tied for first. So this proportional representation, again, favored the USDP more than anybody else, as we expected and as we warned about back in September. And then the makeup of Amyota Luto is slightly more diverse, but really not that much. You have overwhelming domination of the USDP and the military appointees. Again, that was the point. Same thing for state and region Lutos. In this case, for proportional representation, there is exactly one district in the entire country where USDP came second. All of the other ones, the USDP came first again. So the makeup of those new parliaments similarly is very, very USDP. You can see all other parties together only amount to the same number roughly as the military appointees. So the domination of the military is complete in this new parliament. That was to be expected. However, something that has been a little bit lost in the coverage, and something I really want to highlight, if there's anything that I would like you guys to leave with today, is that most voters in the junta's own elections rejected the USDP. So there might be several reasons to that. One is that likely voters were pressured to the polls, but not necessarily in the polls. So they might have some agency in the polling booth to vote anybody but USDP. The people who went to vote at gunpoint knew basically the USDP. The other parties had very little visibility, but what mattered is that they were not the closely associated to the junta. So this is especially telling that only about 44–45% across all elections across the country went to the USDP, with the majority going to other parties. But again, this is sufficient to dominate the junta's parliament. So this is food for thought. People were forced to vote. There was a lot of intimidation, pressure, harassment, and still they reject the USDP. So credit to the people of Myanmar and to their resilience, because I think that's especially telling. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amaël, for explaining about all the technical details of this junta stage elections. And now I would like to invite Ben Lee, the Executive Director of SAC-M, to discuss more about the way forward and in the recommendations that we presented in our paper. We cannot hear you, Ben. No, I think there is some technical issue with your microphone. Okay.
I think Ben is muted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
right now.
you. Great. I've just been
Right.
unmuted.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all of you for joining us today. And SAC-M has very much welcomed the opportunity to partner with ANFREL in this report, and we're incredibly grateful to Amaël as our lead writer. Now, as Amaël has suggested and covered in his presentation today, the junta's approach to its elections was very much premeditated, a premeditated attempt in a years-long campaign to undermine democracy in Myanmar, and a component of Min Aung Hlaing's own personal ambition to secure Myanmar's presidency at any cost. Now, central to this campaign has been the instrumentalization of atrocities, systemic violence, and repression. Let's be clear, these aren't byproducts of Min Aung Hlaing's attempts to put down opponents, real or perceived. They are a deliberate and widespread strategy to inflict maximum punishment and terror on civilians. Now, our report draws on extensive human rights documentation by the UN the UN's Human Rights Office, OHCHR, and the Myanmar Mechanism, and Myanmar civil society in exposing the junta's airstrikes and artillery barrages, its extrajudicial killings and political imprisonment, its razing and destruction of homes, places of worship, and entire villages, its use of forced conscription, and acts of extreme brutality and systematic torture, including sexual violence in detention facilities, and its continued targeting of minority communities, including the Rohingya. Now, importantly, OHCHR has drawn a straight line between the junta's escalating airstrikes and its rollout of its illegitimate elections. OHCHR found that during the election period running December and January, junta aerial attacks killed 170 civilians in 408 discrete incidents across Myanmar. In one emblematic case that Brizza has referred to, there was the bombing of a public hospital in Rakhine on International Human Rights Day, the 10th of December, which killed at least 33 people and wounded at least a further 70 people. Now, according to OHCHR, this was the single deadliest attack on a healthcare facility since the coup. Our report also shows how the junta has instrumentalized the law as a tool of repression. We explore the junta's use of laws pertaining to forced conscription, to the registration of NGOs, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity, among other laws, as a means of bolstering its ranks, destroying dissent, suffocating fundamental freedoms, and building a surveillance state. And then, of course, as both Amaël and Brizza made reference to, there's the election protection law and its imposition of severe draconian punishments for any criticism of or interference with the junta's staged elections. And again, as Amaël and Brizza have made reference to, in just one emblematic example, 3 young people were sentenced to jail terms ranging between 42 to 49 years with hard labor for putting up anti-election stickers in Yangon. Now, 2 things follow from this widespread and systematic violence and repression. Firstly, all of these atrocities were conducted in full view and with the full knowledge of the international community. The UN Secretary General, the UN Special Envoy for Myanmar, Julie Bishop, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, all issued warnings against these elections and warnings of the spike in violence that would inevitably accompany them. So countries can't claim ignorance. Secondly, it is beyond absurd that the junta's parliament, as a lawmaking body, can draw even a passing glance of seriousness when the junta has for years employed violence as a policy and has manipulated the law as a repressive tool. In short, any country that confers legitimacy on the junta is complicit in its crimes. So what's the alternative? Well, drawing from SAC-M's Myanmar's Way Forward report, which we published last December, our new joint report showcases Myanmar's legitimate pro-democracy movement as the only viable path towards a stable and inclusive federal democratic union. We explore recent developments at both the subnational and union levels toward a shared vision for a federal union built on civilian governance, self-determination, equality, and justice. And it's with astonishing resilience, as Amaël said, that it is the Myanmar people who are expanding governance and who are forging a new democratic path, as their widespread rejection of the junta's empty elections showed. Now, based on direct consultations with Myanmar communities in person and via a questionnaire, clear points of cohesion do present across the revolutionary movement. These include agreement on the permanent removal of the military from Myanmar politics, on ethnic equality and self-determination, respect for the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, the importance of unity and coordination among revolutionary forces and actors, and delivering justice for survivors, including through accountability. Drawing on these same voices, our report concludes by setting out actions that the international community, including ASEAN and UN forums, must take to support the Myanmar people. And among these actions, the international community must strengthen its formal engagement with legitimate representatives and institutions, including the newly formed Steering Council for the emergence of a federal democratic union, with ethnic organizations and councils, state units and alliances, Myanmar civil society and minority communities. It must also reverse funding cuts and scale up financial, technical, and capacity building support to revolutionary actors, including again civil society. It needs to expand its coordination to support the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And importantly, it has to support the inclusive negotiation of a new federal democratic constitution that genuinely reflects the will, interests, and aspirations of the Myanmar people. Now, at the same time, on the other side of the coin, the international community also needs to intensify coordinated measures against the junta to put a stop to its atrocity crimes, to secure the release of political prisoners, to ensure the flow of humanitarian assistance. A tightening of the screws on the junta must block its access to cash, munitions, jet fuel, dual-use items, surveillance technology, and also see an outright rejection of the junta's illegitimate elections and a refusal by states, ASEAN, and UN forums to confer legitimacy on the junta in its current or in any future form. Finally, the international community must also hold Min Aung Hlaing and other senior junta members to account and finally put an end to the decades of impunity that has enabled repeated cycles of violence and political upheaval without consequence. Here, ASEAN members have a particularly important role to play, including by cooperating with the International Criminal Court when, as widely expected, it publicly confirms the issuance of an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing. The Philippines, current ASEAN chair, showed its commitment to international law when it facilitated the arrest and transfer of former President Duterte to the ICC for alleged crimes against humanity. It must extend the same cooperation to the ICC concerning Min Aung Hlaing. And other ASEAN members should follow suit. We've seen the appointment by Timor-Leste of a prosecutor to explore potential proceedings against the junta and Min Aung Hlaing for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And just this week, a Rohingya genocide survivor and 10 leading Indonesian public figures, including SAC-M founding member Marzuki Darusman, filed a criminal complaint with the prosecutor's office in Indonesia, accusing Min Aung Hlaing of acts of genocide against the Rohingya. I'll pause here, and I thank all of you again for your interest today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben, for those insights, like the recommendations to different international community, and also what are the things that as international community can, including ASEAN, the other the countries across the world can do to make sure that the junta is accountable for what they did. And I think I would like to remind all of those who are joining with us today. So it's you still have a chance to, if you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the Zoom platform in the question and answer section. And also if you are watching us via live, so you are also able to comment your questions so that we will forward those questions to our speakers later. Just dive into the one question. So we also have a couple of questions about the methodology that we used when it comes to formulating this report. I think Brizza, if you can more elaborate again on the what is the methodology that we deployed when it comes to making this report.
Yeah, thank you, Tarandu. I also saw the perspective shared in the chat group. So actually, thank you for sharing that perspective. At least we have the opportunity to clarify also. So first, of course, we would like to emphasize that we do not claim to have conducted an election observation in this case. So just like what I mentioned, our report is an independent assessment based on available pieces of evidence, documented developments, and established analytical framework rather than a formal observation mission deployed on the ground. Second, our conclusions are not based on a predetermined position, but of course, it is a consistent application of internationally recognized principles for genuine elections. I've mentioned earlier about Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation. That has been the basis of this broader assessment that we did. And just like what Ben mentioned also, our analysis also draws from the well-documented human rights situation in Myanmar, including the work and findings of SAC-M, which provide the critical context on the conditions under which any electoral process has been undertaken. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And I think that's the only question so far that we received in our chat section. Like maybe if you have more questions, like we can answer those quickly. If not, I would like to go back to our speakers. If you have any further reflections, the final reflections before we conclude the launching.
Tanidu, if I may, just since we have no other questions, to add maybe a little bit about what Brizza said on the methodology. This paper presents analysis that we got from a diversity of sources, both public and private. We have also talked to people inside Myanmar who have had on-the-ground observations that they may not be able to share due to safety concerns. So in a way, we have compiled all of these statements and we have consolidated them into our own analysis. Most sources from across the country really depicted like similar pictures, a picture of widespread intimidation, of violence, and increasing violence ahead of the elections as well. And there were also concerns regarding access to data, even within Myanmar. I just want to mention briefly, the UEC website was down. First is geolocked outside of Myanmar, and then was down for most of the election periods, only coming back up sporadically. So even to get official election results or official documentation of the election from the junta, you had to go to secondary sources. And this was most likely intentional. The UEC was not about transparency. That was very clear. And we have also seen in early February, right after the election, the destruction of materials related to the 2020 election and the 2015 to 2020 parliamentary term. So these elections very much are part of a long-term strategy to destroy and burn historical evidence by the junta. So our work was to do our best efforts to compile accurate information and to save it for posterity. So thanks, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And also, if you are still looking for the entire the paper in online, so you can access those the entire paper in ANFREL and SAC-M websites. And also, if you go to our social media platforms, that we also already shared the paper there. So that is consistent of 6 different chapters that we go through from the historical perspective of Myanmar elections until the recommendations that Ben has already laid out very briefly. But in the paper, it's elaborated, and that you can see the entire details there. With that, I think we have one more question or there. We have one question about ASEAN, and then it's their non-interference principle. And then also, I think earlier in the presentations, Brizza and Amaël also mentioned like some of the countries, the junta aligned countries have showed up as international observers about that. Like I think that this question is mostly focusing on ASEAN and its non-interference, uh, the method, the principles, and whether ASEAN has enough capability to pressurize the junta at the end of the day, like to go back to the more democratic principles. The Ben, if do you want to answer the questions, ability of ASEAN when it comes to pressurizing junta?
Thanks very much, Tharandu. The first thing to say was that when ASEAN collectively first responded to Min Aung Hlaing's power grab, its 5-point consensus was considered an unusually strong measure and step against a fellow ASEAN member. That needs to be acknowledged at the outset. What also needs to be acknowledged is that 5 years have passed and Min Aung Hlaing entirely reneged on that agreement within 48 hours before the ink had even dried on it. So we're at a situation now where really the pressure is on ASEAN to collectively decide on a series of escalating punitive measures that it needs to take against the junta if it continues to refuse to stop its violence, refuses to release political prisoners, continues to block humanitarian assistance, and also continues to completely humiliate ASEAN at every turn. Now, we did see a good response from ASEAN in terms of the elections, in that there was no formal observation, there was no recognition. We now need ASEAN to take the further step to say there's going to be no associated recognition of a junta parliament, of a junta government, and there's going to be no access to or participation in ASEAN forums or summits. That's ASEAN collectively. There are also clear opportunities for individual ASEAN members. I mentioned Timor and the principled, and I use that word deliberately, principled approach that it has taken in allowing for a case to be explored into potential crimes committed by Min Aung Hlaing and the junta. Indonesia has revised its criminal code to allow for universal jurisdiction, which again provides opportunities. We have a constellation of maritime ASEAN members, with Singapore the next ASEAN chair, which does present an opportunity for principled influence on what is happening in Myanmar. So there does need to be pressure collectively on ASEAN, but also on specific individual members to be acting in conscientious ways, which I would say is complementary to the ASEAN Charter and certainly to its Human Rights Charter.
Yeah. Also, there is a question on the role of China and then Thailand when it comes to the same particular line with pressurizing junta, and then like we also have seen some of the countries, including China, that congratulated Min Aung Hlaing when it comes to his presidency. So if any reflections on role of China and Thailand also when it comes to this particular issue, maybe any one of you can reflect on that.
I'm happy to say a few words, but I think the position of both countries is predictable, has been in line with their attitude in recent years. We have seen, of course, Chinese pressure on some armed organizations to broker ceasefire and to lower the state of conflict against the junta in some areas. We know much has been written on Chinese influence on the junta and the desire of China to see the junta stage these elections so that they can, through self-legitimation process, they can co-opt the junta as a legitimate member of the international community. And that has been seen. China sent its special envoy for Asian affairs as an observer, as a so-called observer to the junta's elections in December. So I think we don't have much more to say on that than what has been already written by a lot of sources. We know China has been supporting the junta and the junta's intent to stage elections. Similarly, Thailand has been engaging with junta state bodies for years. Even so, Thailand did not technically send observers from Thailand to Myanmar for the elections. However, the Thai ambassador and embassy staff in Yangon very much did observe all three phases of the elections with accreditation from the UEC. In previous years, the UEC was also invited to the Thai Senate election, I think a couple of years ago. So they have been engaging with each other. There's not really a surprise there. And we can see, so before the election, the Thai Foreign Minister expressed the hope that this junta staged election might open dialogue similarly to the 2010 election, which is, of course, junta narrative. So Thailand has been a little bit ambivalent, but ambivalent more on the junta side, because a lot of the junta narrative was taken by Thailand. And we saw on the very first day of the sitting of the Pitu Luto, there was a delegate from Thailand who came and embraced literally Kim Yi to congratulate him on his accession to Speaker of Pitu Luto. The Foreign Minister of Thailand was one of the first to congratulate Min Aung Hlaing, and now Anutin Charnvirakul, the Prime Minister of Thailand, has become the first country leader of ASEAN nations to congratulate Min Aung Hlaing on acceding to president. So this is a long-term strategy. I don't think there's much new that needs to be said, but it is clear there has been support from those two actors. Thank you.
Yeah. And also one more question with regard to the international assistance, what kind of approach that the international community should take when it comes to providing the humanitarian assistance to Myanmar people, and then how it should be handled. There's a question on that as well. If any one of you want to take it. Ben, do you want to?
Thanks, Tharandu. Again, I mean, there are sort of very live and extensive discussions about humanitarian assistance. The first point there is to acknowledge the fact that the junta has for years, for decades really, implemented a very deliberate policy of weaponizing humanitarian need for military advantage. Now, we've seen this through natural disasters. We've seen this through a deliberate blockage of access. We see it through restrictions on UN and other humanitarian organizations. So that's our starting point. The extension of that is there are opportunities for humanitarian access, and these need to be explored by the international community in creative and in principled ways. There are very long established humanitarian organizations, local Myanmar organizations that have cross-border relationships. So cross-border is an immediate way in. This also needs to be done in partnership with ASEAN and with neighboring countries, again, in principled ways. And this also has a core component for the UN. Now, as we say in our report, there's recently been a new resident and humanitarian coordinator who was highly respected, appointed to Myanmar. This is a really positive step, and it again drives home the opportunity and the need for very strong, principled UN coordination in the way it delivers its services, but also in the way it's going to approach engagement now that the illegitimate electoral process has ended.
Tarindo, sorry,
Yeah, Brizza. Yeah,
I
you can.
just wanted to add, because I also read the question that on how, or what's the question again? How should the Burmese people demand and act on this? Just to answer that question, because for the people of Myanmar, the most effective demands are likely to be very clear and concrete with regard to your messaging, and at the same time, practically don't stop and continue. Continue to document abuses, support independent media and civil society, and engage, of course, ASEAN and UN mechanisms. Because looking back, just like what Ben mentioned in the Philippines, when the arrest of former President Duterte happened, it actually it was produced by the nonstop documentation made by the civil society and media. That was the product of a clear documentation. So don't stop documenting until you find the best opportunity. So to make it happen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for all the questions and then for the answers. I think with that, we can conclude our report launch. As we mentioned earlier, report is available in SAC-M and ANFREL websites that you can download and then read the entire report. So with that, we will conclude. Thank you very much for joining us today. So ANFREL and SAC-M both will continue to advocate the recommendations that we made through this report, and then we will be continuing to work with the civil society, regional and other international stakeholders to make sure justice, is for Myanmar, people of Myanmar, and then to see the more democratic Myanmar. Thank you very much for joining us today.